Yeah.
One, two.
Hello there, good morning, and you're very welcome along to this virtual Macra conference. Well, it's almost virtual. We have somewhat of a hybrid because we have a few members here with us in the Heritage in Killenard in County Laois. Damien O'Reilly is my name, and over the next hour and a half or 2 hours or so, we're going to be bringing you this conference with a lot of guests that we have lined up to focus on the issue of climate, the conundrum, young farmers up for the challenge. That's the title of this year's conference, and I do hope that you can stay with us. If you have any questions, you can submit them to us and we will certainly try to get to them. But it's great to have this conference going ahead under the circumstances, and as I said, great to have some people in person here as well in the hotel. But to open proceedings now, I want to hand you over for the first time at an annual conference, the newly elected President of Macra Feirme, John Keane.
Thank you very much, Damien, and thank you very much for tuning in online and for being here and present as well. As Damien said, you're all very welcome to our annual conference, Climate, the Conundrum, Young Farmers Up for the Challenge. In terms of where we are right now as an agricultural sector, there are many challenges and many opportunities in front of us. I think given the context of farming at the moment, the challenges in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the negotiations currently ongoing in CAP, there are not alone challenges, but there are a huge amount of opportunities for farmers and young farmers alike if we get it right. To put Ireland in context in terms of a global leader, in terms of where our agriculture sector is, in terms of where we sit as a global leader in terms of our food production systems, it is important that we continue to drive that bar higher. It is important that we continue to improve and we make the standards that we set within our country unattainable for the pack that's chasing behind. In the context of our young farmers, when we look at our young farmers within this country today, they are among the most educated across the world. Within our own sector, within our own organisation in Macra Feirme, we have the most educated gathering of young farmers anywhere across the globe. And that's thanks to a highly educated system, whether that be through Teagasc, whether that be through our third level education, or whether that be through the practical application of some of the best technologies and practices across the world. We as young farmers see climate, the conundrum, as an opportunity to develop and drive food production systems that deliver the very best in agriculture, that offer us an opportunity to prosper and to grow within the sector. Young farmers want to be part of the solution, and the policy landscape needs to deliver to ensure that young farmers can meet that challenge. We have an opportunity to get it right. We have an opportunity in the context of the Common Agricultural Policy. We have an opportunity in terms of our Climate Action Plan to ensure that there is a viable future for young farmers and for farming in general into the decades ahead. The science will deliver a pathway forward for farming. The science has shown, the research in Teagasc is showing that there are mitigation strategies as well as techniques that can deliver reduced environmental impact from farming, but also to show that there is opportunity for diversification within the farming systems. If we look at the interest and the expressions that there are from young farmers in terms of renewable energies, in terms of branching into anaerobic digestion, as well as improving their ongoing enterprises, whether that be livestock, whether that be tillage, or whether that be other sectors, there is opportunities. And what we need is the policy landscape and the policy regulations to deliver for young farmers. In practice, young farmers and farmers are already responding to the challenges in relation to climate change and the conundrum. And one of the speakers later on in the panel, our own Shane Fitzgerald, Chair of the Ag Affairs Committee, one of the Signpost farms, will demonstrate what farmers are doing on the ground already to meet this challenge. We have figures and facts put on in terms of what our contribution is towards climate in this country. And we've seen over the past number of years our per unit produce in terms of our emissions, in terms of our impact on the environment and climate decrease. And that's the plan in terms of Signpost programme to deliver on that. So yes, there are challenges, but firmly we believe that young farmers are part of the solution and part of the opportunity. The policy context must deliver for young farmers. And in light of that, as Damien already previously touched on, earlier in the week, unfortunately the Minister couldn't make today, but earlier in the week, the Minister sat down with myself and Damien. Initially, he opened with a speech, which I'll introduce to now, and Damien will take it from there once the Minister is finished. So thank you very much for tuning in. Your time is greatly appreciated, and I look forward to speaking to you at the end.
Good morning, everyone. President John Keane, Vice Presidents Claire Goff, Elaine Houlihan, Luna Orifeami, I'm delighted to address your annual conference, and thanks very much for the invitation. Unfortunately, due to the recent spike in COVID cases, obviously, we've had to return to a blend of both online and person. And as an organisation, you've shown excellent agility to move to this type of format, so I commend everyone involved for being able to do this so quickly. John, as it's your first annual conference, I want to commend you on your first year in charge of Macra na Feirme. You've proven yourself to be a constructive, engaging and formidable leader. You've constructively challenged me and my officials in the pursuit of your goals. You're an excellent advocate, I must say, for sustainable Irish agriculture. I very much saw this firsthand at my recent March tour, where you spoke incredibly passionately about the sustainability credentials of Irish farming. And this is a stance, John, which I know we both share. Throughout the negotiations around setting the carbon budgets for each sector, I fought hard to ensure that the sustainability credentials of Irish agriculture were not only recognised, but taken into account as part of the budgetary process. We'll discuss more on that later, but before I start, I want to also pay tribute to your outgoing CEO, Denis Duggan, who I believe finishes his tenure with Macra today. In his 5 years at the helm of Macra, I think it's safe to say that the organisation is in a much stronger position. From my time in opposition to now being minister, Denis has served the elected members and the wider organisation with distinction and with skill. Macra is a real force on the Irish political landscape. Led ably by John and his presidential team, as well as the Ag Affairs Committee, Macra is now well placed to face the future with all the challenges and opportunities that will arise. Denis, I wish you all the very best with Horse Sport Ireland, and I'm sure we'll continue to see lots of you in the time ahead. As you all know, we're nearing the point at which we must submit our CAP strategic plan to the European Commission. I want to thank Macra for being such constructive partners in the process, most notably sitting as a key member of the CAP Consultative Committee of stakeholders. The views and voices of young farmers were well represented here. And separately, I've held a number of bilaterals with Macra, which I found to be very useful and constructive and important in the process. There's a clear focus for young farmers as part of the next CAP. There has been a 50% increase in the national envelope ring fence for young farmers, rising from 2% to 3% in Pillar 1. I'm ensuring that the National Reserve will remain open for young farmers too. The higher rate of 60% for young trained farmers under TAMS will also be in place. And I've also proposed to lift the TAMS investment ceiling from €80,000 to €90,000 in order to support farmers to make investments on their farms in light of rising costs. I have a review into TAMS costings ongoing also, which I expect now will be completed shortly. I've committed to a European innovation project on generational renewal, and I will further support the cooperational measures. I'm currently working my way through a number of proposals, and I hope to bring clarity on that in the coming period. Separately, the Land Mobility Service has been one of the great success stories of agricultural policy over the past few years. I'm a firm believer in using all the tools that are at our availability to leverage generational renewal. Funding through CAP supports young farmers, but initiatives such as Land Mobility Service are crucial. I'm a firm supporter of the service, and I know that as we transition through the next decade, the need to have an agile and fit-for-purpose land mobility service will be crucially important. The department has provided annual funding to the service of €50,000, and this has remained unchanged since its inception. I'm pleased to announce that following positive engagement between John and his team, I've decided to increase the department's contribution by 100% for the year 2022. This is a clear example of my commitment to facilitating generational renewal in our sector. I will shortly engage now with Macra and Teagasc on reshaping the land mobility service for the long term to ensure it is robust for the future. In terms of the climate, we are facing the challenge of a generation, but with young farmers engaged, we can address these challenges and flourish in the process. It's fair to say that our great sector is facing into a very different decade to the one we have just come through. The last decade was one of volume growth. The next decade will be one of sustainable value growth. This is a central tenet of the Food Vision 2030 strategy I launched earlier this year, and one that Macra played a key role in supporting. We are a sector that touches off every rural parish in the country, that generates over €14 billion in exports, and a sector that supports hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country. The Climate Action Plan has set a target of 22 to 30% reductions in emissions from the sector. Let me be clear that this is a challenging target. However, it is a target that I believe is achievable, and it is a target that is in line with the programme for government of recognising the importance of agriculture as well as the unique science behind our sector. It's also a target that is significantly lower than all other sectors in the economy. It's crucial that we also recognise the positive environmental action engaged in over many years by farmers, and the government supports you in taking the further steps required to meet our increased ambition now. Our farmers continue to be genuine pioneers in this area. Yes, all sectors must play their part, and the narrative that agriculture should be singled out for having a greater hill to climb is unfair and wrong. Government policy recognises that every sector, including agriculture, will have to make a real contribution if we are to reach our climate objectives. But the creation of a narrative by some that alienates our farmers is unhelpful. And we must work together on this if we want it to work. I'm very proud that the agriculture sector is the first sector in Ireland to produce a credible roadmap, transitioning the sector towards our long-term ambition of climate neutrality by 2050, fully in line with the programme for government commitments. Acclimatise will continue to play a pivotal role as we move forward on this journey. But we will build on Acclimatise as part of the Climate Action Plan, and I know Macra will be crucial in shaping this roadmap. Our agri-food sector is dominated by livestock. We've 80% of our agricultural area under permanent grassland, underpinning our world-famous grass-based production system, producing beef and dairy products that are exported to 180 countries all over the world. The sector accounts for 8% of all employment and 10% of all exports that leave Ireland are agri-food based. The recently launched Food Vision forecasts our agri-food exports to grow to €21 billion over the next decade, with our existing world-class farming and food production models very much at the core of the strategy. This decade will be a decade of change for Irish agriculture, but I can assure you that in 10 years' time, even in 20 years' time and beyond, producing high-quality meat and milk protein will remain the bedrock of Ireland's agri-food industry. This will be backed by our own ambition for a vibrant tillage sector too. By delivering on the ambition and the ambitious vision as set out in the Climate Action Plan towards climate neutrality, we can protect the Irish family farm for generations to come, as well as protecting our environment. Change is inevitable and change is a constant. I will absolutely back our sector and our farmers at every step along this journey. Mr. President and the rest of Macra na Feirme, I again thank you for inviting me to speak with you at your annual conference. I sincerely hope to be with you at your conference in person next year. If I'm to leave you with one message, one clear message here this morning, it is this. I have supported young farmers. I am supporting young farmers, and I will continue to support young farmers. Without you, we will have no future. And I want to ensure that this is a sector that young people are genuinely excited and enthused about. Thank you very much.
And that was the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Charlie McConalogue, speaking to you a little bit earlier this week. He couldn't be here live with us today. Now, following that address earlier in the week, the Minister had a conversation with the President, John Keane.
Thanks very much, Damien, and very glad to be sitting here and talking with you in response to some of the Minister's comments as well. And I suppose the first thing is to acknowledge the Minister's time and his contribution and commitment to engaging with young farmers and with Macra. I suppose I can only speak for my tenure since May, but I know beforehand highly engaged with Thomas as well from the viewpoint of young farmers. In general, I think, Damien, from to follow on from the Minister's comments, we have a huge opportunity at the moment. And I think it is in that context that the CAP and the Climate Action Plan must deliver a future for young farmers and must deliver a pathway for us. And there are a number of measures and interventions which we have worked with the Minister and his officials on over the past number of months, particularly in the context of CAP, to address the challenges for young farmers around generation renewal, the access to land, the access to credit, the investment support have been some of our major topics and some of the major instruments which we feel that need support. And I suppose it is important for me to welcome and acknowledge the increased contribution from the Department for the Land Mobility Service. It is a service which has a proven track record over the past number of years. And I do know from speaking with the department that there is an appetite for further investment within this programme as the programme proceeds over the next number of years. And I think this is the first step along that road. I suppose my comments to the Minister would be particularly in relation to the access to finance and the challenges that young farmers face in relation to that. We have young farmers who have consistently highlighted that as being an issue. We also have the issue of investment support. The two of those measures are intrinsically linked. And I suppose the final piece in terms of that jigsaw is definitely in terms of succession and on-farm succession. We have seen the number of young farmers decrease by 15% in the last decade or so, while the number of farmers over the age of 65 has increased from in the region of 36,000 to over 40,000. And I'd like to ask the Minister and put it to the Minister of what his plans are for the next decade and how many young farmers he sees as being actively farming at the end of the period of the next CAP, and how we as Macra and we as young farmers can help to progress that along the next number of years, both in the context of CAP and also in context of the climate challenge.
Yeah, thanks, John. And listen, thanks for your acknowledgement there in terms of the land mobility funding. And listen, again, thanks to yourself and indeed all of the Macra team and your officers right around the country for the engagement, both at national level and also at regional level, as I've travelled to many marches to have meetings in each county as part of the consultative process, and consistently Macra voices and Macra contributions to those meetings have stood out in terms of how progressive they've been, and in terms of the attitude that young farmers have that there can be a really strong future for Irish agriculture, and that's something that I fully believe. I believe that the next decade will be a really strong one for Irish agri-food, and particularly for primary producers. Any sector of an economy or any industry that can show in the decade ahead that it is sustainable from an environmental point of view and that it is sustainable from an emissions point of view can expect to be very successful as the decade progresses. And Irish agriculture starts off the decade in that position. We're among the most sustainable food producing nations in the world. And that gives us a very strong starting point. And that's something that we will build on as the decade progresses. And I believe the CAP programme that I proposed and which I've been consulting on, and also the Climate Action Plan targets which we have secured are ones which are appropriate to agriculture and which can allow agriculture to get stronger as the decade evolves. So while we've seen a lot of volume growth over the last decade, the next decade will be about that sustainable value growth. And ultimately, what that needs to deliver and what that will deliver, in my view, is enhanced family farm incomes. But crucial to driving all that will be young farmers taking up farming as a livelihood and as a profession. The cap is therefore really important in relation to that. I think the 50% increase in Pillar 1, and I know you were central to achieving that, but and also that you want to see that more. But I do believe that 50% increase in Pillar 1 funding will be significant in terms of supporting young farmers, and also the supports and the additional supports, particularly for on-farm investment in Pillar 2, but particularly as well the significant increase in funding for Pillar 2 across the various schemes, I think will be important and in terms of underpinning farm family incomes starting out in this decade and as we develop through the decade. But crucial to the success of agriculture will be about the income that we can achieve from the product that comes off our farms. And I've no doubt the young farmers coming in there will continue to build on the world-class food we have, but by addressing that emissions challenge, by lowering the emissions of the food we're producing, will make it more stronger and more attractive to consumers nationally and internationally, and add value to it too. And I think that combination will see this and see agriculture being an attractive profession for young farmers as the decade progresses. And certainly I will continue to engage with yourselves and do all I can to support young farmers in terms of the measures and financial supports that are in place.
Thank you, Minister. And I suppose just some comments from myself and finally pass it back to yourself. In terms of the challenges that we as young farmers face, and we've gone around to our members on countless occasions to get their input into what affects them entering into the sector and what it is that prevents people from entering and what are the main barriers and challenges when they do enter. And I would ask you and your officials as well, in that light, the access to finance, the access to land, the investment support, the startup support, increasing the ceiling in TAMS is welcome. We have asked for an increase in the percentage of sharing with the percentage of allocation for young farmers to be increased from 60% is in the context of that also. And in the wider context of the environment and meeting our 22 to 30% targets that have been set out for the sector. And we recognise that there are 40 actions as laid out in the Climate Action Plan for the agriculture sector to work within. It is important and it's very imperative that the department and yourself are continuing to engage but actively listen and provide actual and real support for us. And I know you have endeavoured to do that, and it is a credit to you in terms of the engagement. But I think in terms of direct interventions that are preventing barriers for young farmers and that are causing stress for young farmers entering the sector, we do need more specific and tailored supports for that. And I would welcome, and the organisation would welcome, and young farmers across the country would welcome direct measures that would support and remove those barriers in relation to succession pathways, in relation to access to finance, in relation to the TAM support. And I also welcome your contribution at the start in terms of the forgotten farmers. We have for a long number of years been lobbying very hard for those forgotten farmers to have had a place within CAP and within the context of supports. And it is important that those are delivered on. So I look forward to the next number of months that we can continue to engage and constructively work on these issues. But we do have to see those active supports and interventions being put in place in the short term for young farmers so that young farmers can deliver in the long term for the agri sector.
Thanks, John. No, I think you make your points very clearly, and there is absolute merit and substance to them all. And I think that point you make in relation to accessible and affordable finance is a really important one. Obviously, we've seen, good progress in the last 2, 3, 4 years around lower finance options through SBCI, and there's real opportunity there, and that's something I want to develop in the period ahead to ensure we can maximise that. And particularly, I think there's opportunity there to ensure that supports young farmers. The TAMS on farm investment and the land mobility I know is key. That's why I am a strong supporter and will work with you in relation to how we can step that forward, because there needs to be the opportunities for young farmers to get into the industry and to be set up in the industry and to make a real go of it. As I say, I do expect it to be a strong sector over the course of the next decade, but key to driving that is new blood and enthusiasm and innovation, and that dynamism coming into the sector through young farmers. So listen, I look forward to continuing to work with you over the course of the next year in the way we did over the course of the last, with yourself and both with Thomas, who is a very progressive leader of Macra na Feirme as well, and handed over very strongly and smoothly to yourself. So listen, I look forward to hearing the outcome from the conference this year, and to continuing the work then in the time ahead. So thanks very much, John, and thanks for the invitation to address the conference today too.
And that was the Minister for Agriculture and President of Macra na Feirme as well, John Keane. And we'll be hearing from John a little bit later on. And our thanks to the Minister for opening this year's Macra conference. If you've just joined us, you're very welcome along to this event. Over the next couple of hours, we have numerous experts and a couple of panels to tease out the big issues and challenges facing young farmers in particular as we enter a critical decade of producing food in an economic, social and environmentally sustainable manner. How can we get there? How can farmers benefit from all of these changes that have to happen in line with the environment benefiting as well? That's going to be the general focus of the conversation this morning. Okay, to our first panel, and I'm delighted to say they're all joining us virtually today, like so many of you as well. If you do have questions, and indeed if any of our in-house guests and members have questions, we will try to put them to our panel. But first of all, I want to welcome along, to make sure they're there, Eoin Lowry, Diana Lenzi and Declan McAvoy. They should be with us. Yes, indeed, there's Eoin. Good morning to you, Eoin.
Morning,
and good morning to Declan. And coming in
Damien.
from CEJA in Brussels is Diana Lenzi. And just to introduce our panellists for you, first of all, we have Eoin Lowry. Eoin joined Bank of Ireland in 2020 as head of Agri to support the bank's growth strategy in agribusiness and farming. He's worked right across the industry and will be known to many of you as the former agri-business editor with the Farmers Journal. Declan McAvoy is head of tax with IFAC Accountants. He leads the tax team and specialises in advising agri-business clients and has specialist knowledge of tax issues in the agri-business sector spanning 3 decades. And we're delighted to welcome and congratulate the new president of the European Young Farmers Body, CEJA, of course, of which Macra is very much aligned. And Diana was elected earlier this year. By day, she's a young farmer from Tuscany, where since 2008 she's managed her family's winery. Some of us get the really good jobs, don't we, Diana?
Very true. Anytime I have to talk about rural areas, I have to remind myself that I am one of the very, very lucky ones, and my rural area is the beautiful hills of Tuscany. So I try to set myself also in a more I try to find a way to picture myself in different parts of Europe so that I can actually be representative of everyone. But well,
for a lot of farmers that are here today in the cold weather, and they probably do envy life in Tuscany, although it can get cold at this time of the year. But Diana,
it is rainy and foggy, so I feel pretty much in line with.
You feel pretty Irish today, Diana. Just I suppose you're only a short time in the job, but I know you've been involved with CEJA and young farm politics across Europe for a number of years now. What I'd like to know is, do you see, a common thread in terms of the challenges and opportunities, maybe beginning with the challenges, as you visit your members right across Europe, what's a common theme right now?
Well, yes, there's a lot that keeps us in common, and there's a lot that makes us different. And I'll say that what makes us different is what also makes us very beautiful. While I was campaigning, I'm very lucky to actually have the ex-president of Macra as one of my vice presidents, Thomas Duffy. It was very interesting to see that with every single conversation I had with the constituents, so it's 33 different young farmers organizations from 23 member states. So we're talking about a very vast territory and a very vast type of agriculture. There was a common thread. People are very worried about the sustainability of their farms. And mainly the economic sustainability of their farms. It's how are we going to actually take over? How can we put up a business plan, an investment plan? How can we renovate and still stay sustainable? How can I make sure that I make a dignified livelihood out of what I have decided is going to be my job, is going to be my life mission in terms of work? And that is a very common thread. There is a lot of worry and concern also seeing policies set goals in terms of instead ecological sustainability. And there is this desire to meet that ambition. There is the desire to be the generation of farmers who will achieve, who will improve sustainability at farm level, who will leave a better agriculture for the next generation. But there's also a lot of concern on how do I actually do it? How do I make ends meet? How do I make sure that I have all the tools that I need and that I'm just not funneled into a revolution where nobody's actually calculated the costs, the consequences, and what is really needed to achieve those goals that everybody is happy in being involved with.
Yeah, and I suppose access to funds is a big issue. And I'm going to come back to you and to Declan to talk about that, about financing farming into the future, particularly from a young farmer's perspective. But Eoin, Lowry, I'm going to go to you now at this point, because I do believe you have to leave us a little bit early, so you can tell us what time you got to go at. That's fine. But the first question, I suppose, the most important question, are the banks lending?
Absolutely, Damien. We're seeing huge growth in lending, particularly since the emergence of the pandemic, I suppose, as we came out of it in 2021. There was a slight slowdown last year, and that was maybe mainly because of the postponement of activity due to COVID. In terms of land sales, maybe some slowness in farm development because builders weren't available or building supplies wasn't available. But definitely from 2021, we've seen a huge pickup in growth and in applications. Insofar as the market is up for the half year, was up 20% this year. So funds are absolutely moving out to farms, and there's significant, I suppose, interest and appetite to expand and develop farms. What we have seen, I suppose, if we look at the longer term picture and what has happened in the last 10 years, we've seen the level of debt on farms reduce by about 25%. Remember, Damien, that only a third of farms have debt, so we are actually quite lowly borrowed in terms of other sectors, but also in terms of our competitors and other farmers globally. But alongside that, we've seen an increase in debt by about 25%, an increase in funds by about 25% flowing onto farms over the last 10 years, which means that the debt has become younger on farms and there's less of it. So that puts us in a very good, strong position globally and competitively as well.
Where is that debt?
So the majority of debt that would be on Irish farms would be relating to land, and farm buildings would make up a big proportion of it. And then maybe around a third or 25% of it would be relating to working capital. But the majority of debt is in assets such as buildings, machinery, and land.
Right. And is that debt being serviced, or are there many farms in financial trouble that you're dealing with?
No, the sector has been consistently very solid down through, the financial crisis and all over the last 10 years. It is seen as a very important sector, even within Bank of Ireland. It is our largest sector within business banking. It's a very high quality sector. Farmers tend to, in times in good times, they tend to pay down debt. They pay it down quicker than they maybe have taken out the term of the loan originally. And very few defaults are seen, particularly with ourselves. I suppose we understand farming, we try to work with farmers through the cycles, such as the one that we're seeing at the moment where commodity prices are high, but we realise also that there'll be times when the commodity cycles will be at lower and it will be more challenging. And I suppose we've developed products that provide farmers the flexibility to take, for example, payment breaks. We have a product that called Agri where farmers can take payment breaks and pay interest only for periods of up to 12 months over a 5-year term. So again, understanding that flexibility needs to be there for times where it may be a little bit more challenging for farmers.
And Eoin, now as we face all the challenges ahead in relation to ag climatised carbon budgets, the EU Green Deal, Farm to Fork, all of these environmentally focused schemes, which will require obviously funding from Europe, from government, but also some investment as well from farmers. Have you any bespoke packages put together? Are you offering green financing now to farmers?
Yeah, look, I suppose there's no doubt that the sector has to improve its environmental footprint. It has a responsibility to do that. And that's the stark reality, Damien, is that the way we farmed in the past will not be the way we will farm in the future. I suppose we recognise that as a bank, that the sector needs to play its part in meeting its global environmental challenge. And we also understand that the role that we play in enabling our customers and farmers to go on that journey to improve the carbon footprint of their farms. So it's very important that finance continues to flow onto those businesses and farms to meet those environmental challenges. And I think that we will be able to, as a bank, we'll be able to be there to bridge that gap between finance and sustainability. And to your point, I suppose, what have we been doing specifically? So we have a number of products, such as we have a sustainability fund that we launched back a couple of years ago. We've increased that to about 5 billion now. And that's money that's available there for green investment. What we have specifically then in terms of products is we have a product that it's called a green loan, and it's for farming and other sectors, but specifically in relation to farming, it's for on-farm investment that improves the overall efficiency or environmental footprint of farms. So for example, for investments such as slurry storage, for less slurry equipment, LESS slurry equipment, that comes at a discounted rate of 0.5% to our standard product. So again, it's trying to encourage the sector to invest in developments that improve the overall carbon footprint of the sector and environmental footprint of the sector. But what we're also looking at, Damien, and I think it's important to stress, while we don't look for a carbon footprint of a farm today, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that in the future, we will be looking to and asking farmers for what the carbon footprint is of their farms, because it's a very important metric so that we can show as a bank that we're investing in assets and in farms and in assets and customers that are improving the way they farm and through the investments that they're funding through us on their farms.
Okay, I think your last answer there kind of leads me into the next question, which we're getting a couple of questions from participants on, and that's, I suppose, the bank and your response to a recent letter from an MEP encouraging the banks to be very careful about lending to farmers. What is your response to that? Have you seen that letter?
I've seen the reports of that. Absolutely. As a bank, we have not changed our appetite to lending to the sector. We have been engaging very much with the industry and stakeholders with the industry, and it was to understand the challenges that are coming ahead to farmers. Because again, what we're lending to, in many cases, we could be lending to farms for up to 15 or 20 years at times. So it's very important that we understand the challenges are such as climate change and how that's going to impact on farming. So we've been heavily engaged in that. So this, I suppose, the carbon budgets that were announced last week, a couple of weeks ago, have given us great clarity as to the direction of travel that we will be heading on farms. What we see is that there's going to be a requirement for more and further investment in farms to meet the climate challenge. And that can come, as I said before, that will be in all forms of storage, less solar panels, renewable energies. That's going to require funding and investment, and it won't be done from farmers' cash flow. While some of it will be, there will be a requirement for finance. Very much aligned with that will be the need for increased efficiency. So increased efficiency around labour-saving devices, IT data to back up that decision-making. And that is all going to improve productivity and improve the cash flows on farms. So if you have greater investment on farms, we can make our farms greener, more efficient, and more climate friendly. And so I suppose my very strong view on this is that this will not change how we look at the sector or how we bank the sector into the future.
Okay, and Eoin, as I said, I know you got to leave us shortly, but if you can stay with us for another few minutes, and I'll come back to you because Declan McAvoy has been waiting patiently there. Good morning to you, Declan. I suppose a very broad question. Eoin is saying there the banks are lending, the money is there are bespoke packages for young farmers. What's your advice as an accountant? Of course, we'll go to the accountant first to get some advice before we go into the bank manager with a wheelbarrow to take money out. So what advice are you giving to young farmers now?
Well, the first thing they have to look at is the whole viability of the farm itself, and if they're going to the bank, have a proper business plan done. Eoin would, echo this. It's no use just turning up in the bank and saying to the bank, I want to borrow X amount of money. You have to have a plan. You have to have, a historic look at the farm, and also, what Eoin said there, looking forward and showing what the farm is going to do and look at the improvements. And then see, will that improvements, it'll probably hit income in the short term where we are, with environmental and the climate, but in the longer term, it should add to both the sustainability and viability of the farm. And are you surprised to hear about the 1/3 debt? What's your analysis of that? Is that good? Is it healthy? Or what do you feel about that idea? I mean, debt sounds like something terrible, but I mean, the biggest, most successful businesses in the world have debt. So as long as it's manageable, I suppose. Yeah, but unless a farm is being progressive and continually investing in the business, it will stagnate. It's like any business, it has to keep investing. And there is some farms are able to sustain the investment, let it be from off-farm income or what the farm is generating. There's a lot of farms then with modernization, needs debt financing. And at the interest rates we're at the moment, debt financing is viable in the vast majority of farms. The biggest difficulty that people have with it is access to land. And the cost of land now and trying to finance land, it's a single biggest barrier, that guys may not be able to lease, but there could be a portion of land coming up to them to buy, and they're just not able to finance it because just land is too expensive. I remember your survey earlier this year, the IFAC survey among farmers, and one of the figures that jumped out was that 86% of respondents said that they plan to increase cattle numbers. What is your advice to farmers coming in, I suppose, looking to do that, considering what is coming down the road, Declan? That's a very political question, Damien, where it's happening. But, look, guys, viability of the farm has to be, and they have to look at the farm. Is there going to be an overall increase in livestock numbers in the country? There's probably not going to be. And farmers are custodians of the land and of the environment. So with proper farming methods and bringing in some of the changes using technology and everything, it's not going to be as bad as it's probably made out to be. And it comes back to, and John, the president, said there a while ago, viability on farms, and young farmers want to farm. So it's hugely, hugely important that if they have to invest in stock and in stock numbers, yes, but again, have it by way of a proper plan. Okay, Eoin, I'm going to come back to you before we have to let you go, but I just want to go back to Diana because Declan talked about their access to land, and we know it's an issue that Macra and Feirme are very keen on, and it was mentioned by the minister as well. What about access to land? Is it an issue across Europe for young farmers, and how do you propose to deal with that?
It absolutely is. We've always considered that there are basically three traditional roadblocks. And the first one is access to land, but it's directly then linked to access to credit, which is what we've been discussing. And it comes then in a third angle around access to knowledge and skills. Basically, we can't tackle problem number one without tackling the other two, and vice versa at any one of the problems we look at. And CEJA has been discussing quite a bit about access to land, and especially land use. It's going to be one of the big conversations that we're going to start in January and February of 2022. And also with what is coming out with some of the research that is coming from the JRC on access to land and land use in Europe, and how basically some of the measures of the cap have influenced the cost of land, have capitalized land. It's something that really concerns us. And with the new cap reform, we don't want to see this getting worse. Because for young farmers, or farmers who don't come from a farming tradition, do not have a family farm to inherit, which has its own set of problems, to basically enter our sector is prohibitive. As very well highlighted, the cost of land is absolutely inaccessible. And for a young entrepreneur who wants to invest in agriculture and who looks at a bank to start financing his project, his ambitions, there's research that tells us that 2 out of 3 times his request is going to be denied, because not having the collateral, not having the financial stability that is required by a bank to grant a credit, this is often refused. And so if we do instead, on the other hand, want to resolve one of the big problems and big issues in Europe, which is the fact that we are lacking a new generation of farmers. We are missing the numbers. We have 65% of the European farming population is of farmers who are above the age of 55. And there is only an 11% of farms that is run by someone under the age of 40, which means that in the next 10 years, we will have a generation ready to retire. Farmers never retire, we all know this, but let's say that if we were in an ideal world, we would have a class of farmers ready to retire, but we will have no one to replace them with. And if we don't address those roadblocks, if we don't make credit actually accessible for young entrepreneurs, if we don't make access to land, therefore accessible, we will never solve the equation. We will never have a new generation of farmers coming into this sector. It is a very widely spread problem, but it's also very polarized. You have areas in the central part of Europe, Belgium, Netherlands, where this problem it arrives at an extent of roadblock, and also they have a problem of urbanization, of land being taken from the farming sector for other sectors, that is very preoccupying. And anyway, we look at what the ambitions that come through the new cap or our goals towards sustainability, we will actually need more land to achieve those goals and not less land.
Okay, Diana, I will come back to you in a moment. I wanted to ask you a question just about, I suppose, young women as well, and encouraging and enticing more women into farming. That now that you talk about the low numbers of young farmers, I know we're moving a little bit away from the focus of economics. But as I said, I'm conscious that Eoin is Eoin still with us? Eoin Lowry. Eoin is due to leave us to go to another meeting. So Eoin, can I just ask you before we leave? We have young farmers listening into you now, and they have plans. They have this business plan which Declan spoke about, and they want to go farming. What, I suppose, is your key advice to them, or what's the take-home message for them from you today?
Okay, thanks, Damien. Yeah, very much. Like we see young farming, and I firmly believe in this, that it's about generation renewal. Bank of Ireland is a very old bank. It's the oldest bank that has been in the state, 240 years old. We have banked generations of young farmers, and the young farmers are the future. So first and foremost, that's the most important. But what is the most important thing that farmers can do today? I suppose first is, as Declan has pointed out, have that business plan. But I think there needs to be a shift in terms of how people and farmers and business owners look at banks. Banks are there to be a partner within the business and should be seen as that. Now, that might come as a difficult to swallow, but it's very important that you talk to your bank and you engage with your bank around any plans that you may have around your business. Don't be afraid, I would say as well, around the financials and understanding the financials. I suppose that's why the professional team, such as Declan in IFAC and ourselves in the bank, that's what we're there to do. We launched a program with IFAC only last year called Farm Pro, which is an IT solution, I suppose, that allows the farm accountant, the bank and the farmer to work in partnership together to finance and fund and invest in the farm. And I think that's critical. But at the very most, I suppose, it's all about engagement. It's about understanding your business needs and not being afraid to come to talk to your bank early and have the accountant on board as well.
Okay, and just finally on that then, we may see some disruption to production over the next few years. There is still a lot of talk about reducing cow numbers and certainly curtailing them. What do you say to farmers, particularly young farmers, that in recent times have borrowed money to buy more cows, to build more sheds, based on projections that there was going to be a steady increase in numbers over the next 10 or 20 years? They're now worried that those projections are going to be in trouble.
Yeah, so I suppose what we would have looked at, we would have asked for projections as we we're talking to those farmers. Given the carbon announcements and budgets, I suppose what we did was we sat down and we looked at our what we would call our back book. That's the money that we would have funded to farmers, and I suppose we remain very comfortable that farmers who have borrowed money in the situation, because we look at the long-term milk price, we look at past performance. And we also take into account what likely projections may come on board. But overall, we remain very comfortable with those projections. For individual farmers who may be concerned, I would say first and foremost would be to come talk to us and outline those concerns to us. We do have products that I said and mechanisms where we can provide flexibility to farmers who may not be on the growth journey that they felt that they were in the past. But overall, I suppose we remain confident in the future of the sector and in future of farmers developing their farms.
All right, Eoin, we're going to leave it there with you. Thank you very much for your time this morning. That's Eoin Lowry there of Bank of Ireland, but Diana Lenzi and Declan McAvoy are still with us. Remember, if you have any questions, do let us know online or indeed from in here in the hotel. Now, can I just go back to you, Declan, on the issue of succession and I suppose succession planning? How important is that? And are you surprised that there's still a lot of family farms out there that haven't, I suppose, tackled maybe is the wrong word, but have not a proper succession planning process in place?
Yeah, succession planning is still a major difficulty. And you've heard me say this before, Damien. A plan in the head is not a plan. You know, the owner of the farm may have the ideas around succession, but around succession, the most important thing, first of all, is communication. Need to talk about the farm, need to talk about with the next generation about what timelines on coming in. And on timelines, it creates the first obstacle to succession. Normally, it's left too late. You know, the retiring farmer hasn't thought about succession until suddenly next year I want to stand back and retiring. They need to be talking about it 5 to 10 years out, you know, because the young farmer wants to get involved. They will have plans around it. And in communication, the one thing I would say within communication is the person who is handing over the reins needs to accept that the incoming generation may have different plans or different methodologies of running the farm that they have. And that's where communication and sitting down around the table and discussing it, and then widening it to the other family members, you know, because there is only one pot for people to be looked after out of. And as I would say to people, even though the person getting the farm may on paper be getting something very valuable, in most cases, it's only providing the person who's getting the farm with an income. You know, and a lot of the other family members who are not getting the farm, they may not look to be doing as well on paper as the farmer, but they could actually be doing better by getting a site or even getting a small stipend out of the farm. So it comes back, communication is the single biggest barrier to succession, and not talking about it. Talk openly. We would find that where it's talked about openly, there's a smooth transition and there's far less problems. Where the problems arise, where it's left too late, the aspiration of the retiring farmer and the person taking over may not match, and it can create huge problems.
What about the tax implications in all of this process as well? And let me give you an example. As you said, 40% of farmers don't have a will. There's a lot of family farms at the moment that have the succession plans in their head, but not on paper. If we move it even a step further, enduring power of attorney, how important is that in a family farm context, Declan?
Massively important, and massively important from the point of view, it allows someone to step into the shoes of the farmer if something happens to that farmer through ill health, God forbid, dementia or that. There's two different powers of attorney. There's a power of attorney which is for one specific item, but enduring power of attorney, it's for everything. And it allows the farm to be run as normal, but God forbid, if very serious ill health struck the person down, particularly on the likes of dementia or something on that side where they're not in sound mind. So it would be a fundamental planning tool that's there and advice. And interesting, Damien, since the last time we spoke on this, the amount of solicitors who are now bringing it up with clients, I'd say, has quadrupled. You know, they're saying it right. The first thing we need to do before we do anything is get this enduring power of attorney in place, that God forbid anything happens. And it's positive from that point of view that it's now becoming, you know, a matter of course that it's been put in place. But it needs to be driven home. People need to be educated on it and the importance of it. And it doesn't mean you're handing over control, but what it does is you're putting the farm on a sound footing that if something happens, you.
Somewhat connected to that is the whole issue of the Fair Deal scheme, and there's talk of changes happening there. I'm not sure whether they've actually come into play or not. Not sure whether it's your area or not, Declan, but again, it's something that affects quite a lot of family farms.
Yeah, the new changes have come in, actually. They were signed into law in July this year, July 21, just before the government went on their summer break. And they're positive from the point of view of there's now a 3-year catch on the farm as against previously 5 years are open-ended. You know, it's very new in the scheme as it is today. You know, on the new scheme, you know, the rules are very new and problems are not arising as of yet. I think there's a bigger problem coming up on the Fair Deal is whether the state can fund the cost of it, you know, which is not the issue, but definitely positive moves. And no doubt about it, 12 months or 18 months down the road, as people see the effect of it, it should lead to some tweaks that are there. It's after taking a long time to get these positive changes, but like anything, it will need to evolve somewhat. So with the new changes, it makes the potential charge on the farm limited to 3 years. But we're still looking at if you got hit for the full charge, you know, it's potentially 22.5% of the value of the farm, you know, tied up in it. So the advice would be look at every alternative. Let it be home help. Let it be other family members, you know, funding healthcare to get over that 3-year window.
Okay, stay with me, Declan. Diana is still with us. Diana, just coming back to you on a couple of issues. As I said before we let Eoin go there, you were talking there about the dearth of young farmers right across Europe, and there are so many issues that the farmers online here and in this room face that their counterparts in Italy and Scandinavia and France and Spain face as well. We have a lack of women farmers in this country, a severe shortage. I think 12% of Irish farms are in the names of women. Is that a common problem across Europe, and how do we change that?
It is. I wouldn't have figures there, but what I know for my experience, for example, in Italy, is that very often what happens is that women who are involved in family farms are not considered farmers. There's the male farmer who makes the figure, the number, who's the representative of the farm. And just being a part of the farm doesn't constitute enough for being considered a full-time farmer. But that's a very cultural thing that I think we still need to kind of tackle and address, and is maybe bigger than us today. What is true is that, for example, in CEJA instead, I see a lot of very brilliant women who are emerging, who are sound farmers, who have a very strong entrepreneurial mentality, who are working to improve their farms, who have a life scheme of what they are aiming at in terms of where they want to see their farm go, and that are also finding that the time, just as I did, to be involved in a lobbying activity and an advocacy activity, which is very important. It's important to speak up. It's important to be present and to be the voice of our own interests, because very often the message is distorted. We often hear a lot of policymakers talk about young farmers, yet when they write the policies, the young farmers are never sitting at the table. I've been having to hold my pen or my fingers with my Italian minister in the past few days on this subject. What I see is truly a brilliant class of young women who are stepping up and who are going to be involved in shaping the agricultural system of the future. I think that CEJA is a great gym. It's a space where people can really find the way to build common positions, to promote. We are very propositive. We're always finding solutions that we want to present, because if it is going to be our future, we are the ones who want to have a say in it and how we reshape the texture of European agriculture. And it's going to be a big change, and we need tools. And I must say, I've been really listening with fascination to everything that's been said, because in many other countries of Italy, this doesn't exist. There is not this type of already, let's say, connection between the economic structure and the farmers. There is no communication. The farmers are used to working in a very traditional way, that have a very traditional type of bookkeeping. I always joke that my father's a neurologist, and he inherited his farm, this farm that was a family property, so hardly a farm. It was a bit of a separate thing. And when I took over the farm, instead, I moved here and I made it my life. I decided that this was what I was going to be living off of. And we'd, for the first years, had these furious fights, because anytime that things would be difficult economically, he would say, honey, don't worry, because my grandfather taught me that in farming, you do the balance every 5 years. And I said, Dad, that just can't work. We pay our suppliers month to month, year to year. Every year, our economic balance needs to be in equilibrium, because if it isn't, I don't have 5 years to catch up. In 5 years, I will probably have to be investing on something else. I need to make sure that we have a business plan, a business mentality when we look at our farm. And I see that this is what the new generation is trying to do. This is what we actually have to teach a lot of youth around Europe, that you can farm, but still be an entrepreneur, that you can build a successful business on your farm, that this is how we keep European agriculture together. This is how we do the transition. This is how we become a stronger European agriculture, more sustainable in every front. And this is how we get that famous class or generation of farmers who still don't know they're going to be farmers to come into the sector, by giving them all the skills they need. Today, to be a farmer, you just can't be very good on your tractor or with your animals, or even just have let's say, an innovative type of machinery. You need to be at 360 degrees informed, capable of understanding the finances, the communication, the laws behind it. You need to be incredibly literate. And this is what we think really what we're pushing for in CEJA, is taking those roadblocks I talked about: access to land, access to credit, and access to knowledge and skills, and solving them, each one in its own, but each one for the benefit of the other two.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the job of a farmer is to be a business person, an entrepreneur, a farmer, a midwife, a plumber, a weather forecaster, all in one. Can I ask you about the CAP deal? The Parliament signed off on it this week. As you stand and study it now, what concerns do you have? Do you think it's a good deal for farmers, young farmers in particular, Diana?
We have to see, because right now we're in front of something that is unprecedented, which is what are member states going to do of this CAP reform? What is going to be in the national strategic plans? How are the member states going to comply to this new CAP reform? So I think we're still in that phase of studying. For the young farmers, we did have a win. We, especially with CEJA, had pushed to double the ambition, so to go from a 2% to a 4% of the envelope for direct payments for young farmers. We're happy with having gotten at least a 1% more. It's not what solves the equation at the end of the day, but it is at least showing that there is a little bit more attention in terms of young farmers. What will be very important is to see how instead the member states are going to translate everything that has to do with the investment schemes and with the new first aid installation, because that is where we start a new class of young farmers and bring them into the sector. So we are going to be very vigilant on how the member states are going to deliver on this new CAP. We're just happy there is a CAP, because staying in a situation of uncertainty and stall would have just dragged everyone down. And especially, I'm not sure that if this CAP would have been pulled, we would have gotten a better deal. So let's take what we have, and let's then now try to take the best out of it.
Okay, Diana, stay with us there, and I know Declan is still with us. I think we have a question here from one of our gathered. Do we have a question here from somebody in the room? Yeah, just introduce yourself for the benefit of people that are watching at home, and tell us who your question's directed to.
Hi, Michael Coughlin, Feirme Ag Affairs. Just a question for Eoin Lowry. So, like, if credit and lending is to be made dependent on carbon emissions in the future, like, how is that going to be measured, and especially, like, how is that going to be benchmarked? And so just a bit more detail on that. Like, so in research, typically productive agricultural emissions tend to be calculated per calorie or per hectare, whereas that would lead, if that was applied to Ireland, that would like really inhibit lending towards young Irish farmers, because a lot tend to specialize in producing very high protein dense foods that tend to have lower calories. And this is something that is very biologically difficult to create. So calculating it per calorie would then be completely inappropriate. So I just, how would you respond to that?
Okay, well, I'm going to take that as a point, because Eoin has left us, and I'm not going to attempt to start speaking on behalf of Eoin Lowry. That's that on that one. But thanks indeed for your point on that. Declan, just before we wrap up, going back to you. So, as a point that I made to Eoin a little bit earlier on, your message to the young farmers of Ireland who are tuned in here today, looking into the year 2022 with all of the changes that face them, and it is the younger farmers that are going to have to carry the biggest burden in terms of obviously sustaining their communities, underpinning their, I suppose, ability to continue running the family farm that might have been there for generations, but also, of course, playing their part and on behalf of us all in meeting our climate challenges. There's a lot of mountains to climb there. Young farmers say they're ready and togged out and ready to take the pitch in that regard. But what sort of advice would you give them now, and indeed their families, as they embark on this tough journey?
It goes back, one thing that Diana said that resonated with me hugely, was one of the 3 points, was equip yourself with the knowledge and skills necessary, to meet the challenges, educate yourself. We're heading into a lot of uncertainty around the whole challenges around the climate and that. So all that people can do on that is educate themselves, be willing to take on new technology. And in relation to, the home and the farm, it's back, and I can't say it often enough, is don't be just sitting there waiting for the farm to be handed over. Engage, communicate. If the communication is not coming from your parents or from whoever it is, you start the line of communication with them. And it's something that I see a huge amount of, is the word viability, that suddenly the farm may not be viable enough to support 2 families. So people would need to look at the viability of the farm and see, will it meet the expectations of everyone? So as you can, there's a couple of takeaways there, not just one. But I think if people do those, they'll be well equipped to handle the future.
Yeah, and indeed, as you said, there are some co-ops now that are involved in supporting their suppliers in learning a little bit more about those challenges and in terms of linking up with universities and so on. And Diana, finally to you before I let you go, and thank you indeed for joining us today. It's great to have you at our annual conference. Are you confident that there's enough will at EU level, within the Parliament, within the Commission, and within the various presidencies to support young farmers, considering that, I suppose, the attitudes of an awful lot of people are changing towards food production and how it should be produced and where it should come from, and what we should be eating into the future. It's very much focused in Europe. It's a Western issue. But are you confident enough that the toolkit will be provided by the various policymakers in Brussels to support young farmers into the future in meeting the challenges that have been put in front of them?
I think, again, there's a lot of work to do there, because nothing comes for free, and we're the ones that will actually always have to be present, will always have to be pushing, and will always have to be also sharing our knowledge. What I've come to see in these months, working with the Commission, working with the different DGs, is that there is a desire to understand better our positions. And I think that this is actually something that can be very, very interesting, because the CAP is such a huge part of the EU budget. So the policymakers also have to justify in a way towards the civil society why they are investing so much in agriculture. And so they need also to understand better from the agricultural sector where that money is going, why it is important to keep that support going. And I think that it is a kind of, it could be an interconnected narrative that can work in helping Europe become more interconnected, linked to its food production. We cannot afford to not have a strong European agriculture. And that is something I firmly believe, and that I think that needs to be explained. We need to reconnect people with what they eat, with where it comes from, with the people behind it. And I think that young farmers have the capacity to be very outspoken, to be very real, to be very propositive. And this is why we've always found nice open doors so far when it's come to talking with the Commission. So I know I have to use those open doors to then bring in our content, to bring in our proposals, make sure that they do support the young farmers, that they do support not even the young farmers of today, the me's of today, but basically the generation that still has to come.
Okay. All right, well, we're almost at the end, but I'm going to hold both of you there because we have one more question, actually, speaking of young farmers. So, Shane, if you want to just put your question there.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. I'm
Shane
Fitzgerald here. Yeah, I'm the chairperson of Ag Affairs Committee in Macra. So, just a quick question. It's for both Diana and Declan, really. I suppose Diana can go first. Just in relation specifically to a succession scheme. It's something that we've constantly lobbied the government on and the minister in these MAR tours, just for a well-funded succession scheme. I suppose before the early retirement scheme was something we had here in Ireland, and it didn't work very well. And it's not something that the department is too keen on. I think Diana made a good point that farmers never retire, so I don't think that's going to work. But I suppose I'll be just interested to hear on maybe what approaches are working well in other European countries, and I suppose maybe some of the proposals that CEJA have in Europe at the moment, just in relation to addressing generation renewal. And then just, I suppose, following on from that for Declan, I suppose what can be done at farm level in an Irish context, I suppose, to improve generation renewal? I know you've probably kind of mentioned a few points already around communication and around speaking between the two generations, between parents and the children, I suppose. So that's maybe one point. And then around a policy level, I suppose, what can be done as well just to encourage and facilitate farm succession in this country?
Okay, thanks indeed. And Shane will be joining us in our second panel a little bit later on as well. So Diana, first of all, just are there any quirky succession schemes that you know around Europe that we might be able to look at in Ireland?
It is one of the things we want to investigate. So I will probably be able to have a more complete answer next year when I hopefully participate again in your Congress, because it is one of the big questions. The other thing is why we want to face it is because Europe wants to align its succession schemes in general. So it's asking for certain member states to align their form of taxation, and this will impact a lot of farms. So it's one of the subjects we will be facing in CEJA, taking in our experience and finding that way to use horizontal knowledge to then propose better solutions.
Okay, and Declan, just to you, improving generational renewal. I know you're a great believer in, more phased system for the transfer of farms, but just to answer Shane's question there to you on that.
Yeah, and I'll answer it in two ways. Shane was asking there about policy. I think there's something needed to educate the landowner at the moment, the person who owns the land, of that all the benefits to hand over the farm early, and the improvements it can bring to the farm. But as I said, there's a couple of issues that come up. Income is one of them. Maybe there should be, without a retirement scheme, there should be like some incentive, like the young farmers top up, like a succession top up for X number of years, in addition to the succession credit we have. Now, the succession tax credit and the succession partnership credit is a good way because it can phase people in and also phase people out. The difficulty with the scheme we have at the moment is it's restrictive. And if I was to say one thing, and it's from working with some different organizations, with the government departments, take the scheme that's there and work on it and adapt it instead of coming up with something new, because it's easier for the government departments to adapt the scheme that's already there. And I think if that succession partnership scheme was adapted and a bit of work put into it, together with a top up for 5 years, it could transition it in 5 years, that succession suddenly becomes that the barriers that are there could suddenly be removed hugely.
Okay, well, there is a Netflix series, is it, called Succession at the moment, which some people might be watching, so I don't know whether there are any comparisons there, but I think what your take-home message here today is, Declan, for the young farmers here, go visit your parents this evening, bring them a nice cake, maybe a bottle of whiskey, or bring them out for a meal and say, we have to talk. Get them into a good mood before they actually do it. Diana and Declan, thank you both very much, and to Eoin Lowry, we give them a round of applause for joining us today and being so kind with their time. All right, we're going to take a short break. Don't go away, as they say. We're going to be back with you a little bit after 12 o'clock. So let's say in about 15 minutes, we will resume at 12:05. So if you need to go and make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever like that, do so. And rejoin us in about 15 minutes when we will move on with our next and final panel of the day. Thank you.
Hiya, Frank.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Can indeed.
Who am I talking to there?
No, it's Pat Murphy here, Frank.
Pat, how are you?
I'm good.
I
I just want to stop for 1 second here now, and I'll be back to you in 2 seconds.
Okay.
Hello, Pat and Frank. Just be aware that the attendees will be hearing in the call. They won't see you, but they will hear you. Thank you.
It'll die as soon as people can get away from it, I think.
Yeah, it will, but you know what, that's okay too, because we're looking forward to getting back into doing events like this. Like
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Without all the palaver of webcasting.
People hate Zoom, they just hate it.
A lot of people do. A lot of people do. And none of this technology, streaming technology is perfect.
That's it.
Issues every day, including say, things that you guys don't know about, but we're seeing it.
I know, yeah. And, well, I was doing a Zoom thing at home a while ago and the audio went. I can't figure out why. So what do you do?
Well, if you ever need help in any of that kind of stuff, just...
Pardon?
If you ever need help in any of that stuff, just get a number off the girls and we'll advise you.
What's your company called?
My Webinar. mywebinar.ie.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
And you're very welcome back to the Macra Feirme conference. This year it is a hybrid, so to all of you at home, you're welcome back. To those joining us, you're very welcome along. And we do have some Macra members here with us in the Hermitage Hotel as well, just outside Port Leash. Now, I hope you enjoyed our first panel discussion. And once again, thanks to all of our panelists for their time this morning. I hope you learned something from the suggestions and the advice that they had. And we're going to move on now for the next 3/4 of an hour or so with our next panel, who once again will be looking at the EU farm to fork proposals, the challenges that are facing young farmers, how will the climate action plan affect young farmers, how young farmers can work with new technologies available to them. And we'll try to envisage what the young farmers of tomorrow will be able to do to meet the challenges that they're going to face. We have a mix of online and in-person guests here for you. We have Colm McCarthy, Shane Fitzgerald, Professor Franco Macra, and Pat Murphy. I'm going to call in first our two online guests. Professor Franco Macra is the newly appointed Director of Teagasc, where before he was Director of Research with over 30 years technical and research experience. And Pat Murphy is CEO of the Kerry Group's dairy business and Chair of Dairy Industry Ireland. With me here in person, Colm McCarthy is an Irish economist who lectures in the School of Economics in UCD and is well known for his commentary on economic matters and has weekly columns in the Sunday Independent and the Farmers Journal. And Shane Fitzgerald, whom we heard from a little bit earlier, Shane is chairman of the Macra Agricultural Affairs Committee
He's a Signpost dairy farmer as well from County Waterford. So you're all very welcome along. Frank O'Mara, good afternoon to you.
Hello, Damien, and hello, everybody.
It's good to have you, Frank, and I'm going to begin with you. Congratulations on your recent appointment, by the way. You're going to have a busy time ahead of you. I suppose what we want to know are young farmers, are they equipped to deal with all the detail regarding national emission targets via, and I'm just going to list a few of them, the Ag Climatise, the Climate Action Bill, Climate Budget, the COP, Farm to Fork, Green Deal, and so on. They're all colliding at once to map out future direction for farming in the EU, globally, and of course, particularly here in Ireland. When you wrap them all up, how big and how achievable are these challenges facing agriculture over the next decade to begin with, and then into the longer term towards 2050?
Thanks, Damien, for an easy question to start anyway. And look, before I get going, look, thanks very much to Macra for the invitation to speak here. And this is my first time since becoming director to speak at a Macra event. And I just wanted to say Teagasc has a very good relationship with Macra, and I'll be trying to build on that relationship. You know, we're very well represented on our authority by John Buckley. And we obviously see the young farmers as the future of the industry. And look, we're very committed to working with young farmers and assisting them in any way that we can. So look, Damien, you mentioned a whole, an alphabet soup really of strategies and proposals and so on, and people could be forgiven for becoming a bit bewildered by all the various strategies and directions and so on that are being proposed for the industry. And look, to bring it all back home, here in Ireland, we obviously have to be well aware of the international developments and so on. But we have here in Ireland developed our own strategy for the industry called Food Vision 2030. And that was developed, by an all of industry group, including all the farm organisations, the processing industry, the likes of ourselves and Borbia and so on. And I'd say, look, that sets the direction for the Irish agri-food industry, and it takes on board all the kind of stuff that's in those international international strategies and international policies and so on. And even that now, you know what I mean? I wouldn't expect a farmer to have that in the milking parlour or up in the front window of the tractor or anything like that, that Food Vision 2030 strategy. There is a need, obviously, to bring it down to what that means for individual farmers. And I'm delighted you have Shane there as one of the Signpost Farmers, which is our program, I suppose, to first of all, to use farmers like Shane to adopt the technologies that we think are important for the future, and then to use Shane as an exemplar farmer then that other farmers can see, well, look, I'm seeing what he's doing. It's not the end of the world yet. There are changes ahead for me. I'm going to have to farm in a different way over the next decade, but it's not as if I'm going to have to throw out the baby as well as the bathwater. And there is a future in farming, and I think, look, that's the message that we would have overall, that while there are very challenging targets for agriculture, both in terms of climate change and in terms of water quality and so on, there is a pathway to reaching those targets through efficiency and technology. It will involve a lot of change, and on that journey, you can be sure that we'll be keeping a very clear view that farmers, in the end of the day, have to make a livelihood out of their business as well. So look, while loads of challenges, I think we shouldn't keel over because of the size of the challenges. I was delighted with the title of this conferences, which is Young Farmers Up for the Challenge, and that's my perception, that farmers are gearing up for these challenges and are committed actually to meeting them head on and to putting the industry on a very sustainable pathway for the future. And by that sustainable pathway, I mean in every sense of the word.
Yeah, you mentioned the Food Vision 2030 strategy there under the auspices of Tom Arnold and his team. And when I think of that, and then I look at the climate budgets and the reductions that we need in emissions ahead of 2030, I kind of think of, the unstoppable force and the immovable object. How can both exist, if I can put it like that? How can we reach those emission reduction targets of between 20 and 30% for agriculture while ramping up the value of output
to 21 billion.
Yeah. So look, if you actually look at the food vision strategy, there's 4 missions in there, and one of them is actually about climate smart agriculture. So look, very quickly, Damien, we see 3 steps, I suppose, on the journey to meeting those climate targets. The first is to implement the technologies that we already know about, and that's things like protected urea, low emission slurry spreading, use of clover in order to reduce chemical nitrogen, all the kind of things that Shane is probably doing on his farm already, or would probably hope to do over the next couple of years. That's the first step. That gets us about 1/3 of the way. The second step is we have a number of new technologies that we're researching that are fairly close to being ready to use on farms, and that's additional types of fertilizer as well as the protected urea. It involves possibly the use of feed additives to reduce methane, and it involves the earlier slaughter of beef animals at the same carcass weight. That second tranche of technologies will get us about the second third of the way. And to get us the last third of the way, we are going to need, a lot of research on areas like breeding low emitting animals, developing additives that we can use right throughout the year, not just in the indoor feeding period. And, with that investment in research, I think we can get that last third of the journey. So there is a pathway to reaching the targets. It's a difficult pathway. It's a narrow one. There's twists and turns in it that we can't see around yet, but that pathway is there. And if you stand back and look at what the energy sector or the transport sector have to do, their journeys are equally difficult. We have to have 1 million electric cars on the road by 2030. That's only 9 years away. So that's a big challenge. We have to have 80% or up to 80% of our energy generated by renewables by 2030, at a time when we're going to need a lot extra energy being produced because of all the electric cars and so on. So every sector has a big difficult challenge. Agriculture is probably no difficult to that. But look, I think the important thing is to say that there is a pathway through efficiency and technology.
Okay, Colm McCarthy, interested in your perspective on that. How do we square that circle? You obviously have to maintain the economic survival of rural Ireland and a sector, but at the same time meet these binding targets environmentally, which to all intents and purposes is going to have to involve some technology, but also maybe a reduction in output.
Yeah, I'm kind of unhappy, and have been for a long time, and most economists have been unhappy with territorial production targets as a basis for international agreement on combating climate change. And the wrong turning was taken back in the 1990s. It's unfortunate that the planet has one atmosphere and 200 governments. It'd be kind of neat if there was just one government, or if each country was an individual planet in orbit by itself, when the incentive to control emissions would be clear. And if Ireland had its own atmosphere, it has its own weather, but it doesn't have its own atmosphere, then it would be in our interest to look after our climate. I think you're beginning to see at a European level policy inching towards a different framework from these territorial production targets. And I won't rehearse the arguments that the way emissions are measured is, in a sense, really unfair to Irish agriculture. 35% of emissions here are attributed to agriculture. Average around Europe is 10%. Irish people do not eat 3.5 times as much food as everybody else. It's exported. And a more logical way to do things would have been to levy taxes and charges at the consumer end.
So just on that point, what you're saying, I think you wrote about this as well, that we have a situation where the measurement of emissions for energy versus food, the point of production takes the tab for emissions, yet for energy such as oil, it's where the product is consumed that emissions are counted. Do you reckon that is an anomaly, or is that properly?
Well, what
counted?
do you think? I mean, if you buy some juice from Saudi Arabia, which is where it came from, and stick it in your car, you will pay $1.60 or thereabouts for road diesel. The ex-refinery price of all diesel at the moment is 60 something. I'm not quite sure. So it fluctuates. So there's a very heavy tax on road diesel, which pays for the road system, but it's also a disincentive to the emissions. And you pay it because you're consuming this stuff in your car. So I think that's fair enough. But if this was done the way agricultural emissions are measured, then the blame for the emissions would rest in Saudi Arabia and not on you. This doesn't make sense.
We have a choice whether we want to use a car. We don't have a choice whether to eat or not. That's maybe an argument in that regard.
Yeah, well, you could eat less though, you know, or you could say stop eating dairy products because of emissions and eat plant-based stuff. All these funny kinds of milk made out of, I don't know, bananas or whatever. Can I just draw people's attention to an interesting speech that was made during the week by Michael O'Leary? Michael is the chief executive of Ryanair. And a couple of days ago, he spoke at a conference in which he said, the failure to have any taxes at all on the aviation industry is going to have to end. And you may not be aware of this, but airlines do not pay a penny in tax on jet kerosene, and the stuff they burn in airplanes is a little bit like diesel in terms of its emissions. And there is no tax on marine diesel at all. There's also no value-added tax on airline tickets. And at European Commission level, they're now looking at something called CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which could result in Europe moving towards tariffs on imports from countries that don't have a serious climate policy, for which read China for now, and India and a few other places like that. So the turning that was taken in the 1990s, that we will use quantitative controls on output rather than taxes and charges. It was a choice to go quantity controls rather than prices.
I remember Ryanair wouldn't pay charges in Dublin Airport at the time.
Yeah, true. Michael doesn't have to be consistent. He's right though on this one, I think. What we are beginning to see as policy begins to bite, I mean, these targets that were dished out at Kyoto and subsequently at the various COP meetings, Paris and so on, they're beginning to bite now because it's serious, because we did so little to control emissions worldwide. The time's beginning to run out now, and the scientists are getting genuinely alarmed, and I think they're right. I'm not a climate scientist, but it seems to me that the evidence is pretty solid. So as that is happening, it's beginning to dawn on people that these policies are now going to bite. And it's beginning to dawn on people that maybe the quantity route wasn't that smart, and maybe prices and charges and carbon taxes are a better route. There's an economist in Oxford called Dieter Haum, and some of you may have seen him on TV and stuff. He wrote a big report for the British government and all this a couple of years ago. And Dieter makes the point constantly that if controlling the quantity of output and associated emissions sector by sector and country by country in detail, if that was feasible, then the Soviet Union would have been a success. But it wasn't. And I think we will see, and I think it's important for the farm organizations here to be alert to this, I think we're going to see at European level a bit of a shift back towards things like carbon taxes, and bringing, say, marine diesel, instead of fluting on about food miles, have a tax on marine diesel.
Okay, well, we are where we are in that regard, and the science proves that obviously emissions and targets, and we need to reduce them in particular in relation to agriculture. So the question going back to it is, how do we meet those legislative targets that have been put in place for agriculture, while at the same time meeting the targets set out in the Food Vision 2030 report?
Food Vision 2030 and the Climate Change Committee's report are not consistent, straight up. I agree that farmers should do better with spreading fertilizer and all these various things that can be done to reduce nitrogen and carbon and so on. So fine, let's do all those things. Ultimately, though, it's not Ireland's fault that we have nice weather and climate and rainfall that is suitable for grass-fed dairy production. That's not bad news. That's good news for Europe, because it means you don't have to produce all these dairy products on the boiling plains of Andalusia.
So as you were saying, you don't eat bananas from Cork in the same way that people in Saudi Arabia don't to drink milk from Riyadh.
Well, indeed, I was in Abu Dhabi a few years ago, and they told me that you can get a big subsidy from the government to import silage to feed. They have a few farms with fresh milk and so on.
Well, they do in the desert in Saudi Arabia, using a lot of water resources indeed to milk cows in the Al Marai desert as well. I just want to bring you in, Shane, on this as a young farmer, listening to Colm there. I mean, maybe some of his views, certainly in an environmental perspective, may not be popular as such, but going back to the point is making, we are where we are. You're a dairy farmer facing the challenges ahead. Have we got past the kind of, in want to put it, the whataboutery to the point now where you're saying, look, we're ready to meet the challenges that lie ahead over the next few years?
Yeah, Damien, that's what I was just thinking myself when I was listening to Colm. Like, you can see Colm's unhappy with the way things have been the last number of years, and you can see why farmers and young farmers would be unhappy as well. When you look at the way the carbon is accounted, the way consumption and production is probably not helping farmers. Looking at carbon sequestration is not being recognised for farmers. We obviously account for 35% of greenhouse gas emissions because we don't have other heavy industry, and then also the sectorial targets that obviously doesn't help Ireland. Again, if we reduce production here, it's going to be picked up somewhere else, which is carbon leakage. So you have all those different anomalies, and it's a global aspect, I suppose, to this. But I suppose we have to, as you said, we have to get past that. We can't have that attitude now and saying the whataboutery or what's going to happen if we reduce production here and this kind of sort of thing. But we just know here we have the most sustainable system in the world to produce food, and we just have to make sure that we realise that, and that we all work together to achieve our goals to keep producing that food. I suppose that's the most important thing, and I think we all, as farmers and young farmers, we want to leave the land in a better place than we got it. I think that's the key point. So we just can't keep looking at, I suppose, saying what's happening in the rest of the world. We do have to meet our targets, and we do have to, I suppose, improve what we have. So at the same time as increasing our environmental credentials, but also making sure our farms are viable for the future. So, and as well as being socially sustainable. So it's just the three pillars there, and they all have to be met to make farms sustainable. And I think that's something that, as part, I know Frank mentioned the Signpost programme, that's something we're very much focused on now, is to try and hit these targets by focusing on the technologies. From a young farmer's point of view, we don't even want to contemplate reduction, because no matter what industry you're in or what career, if you're talking about restricting growth, about standing still, nobody wants that. It's not an enticing future for a young person to come into. So we need to make sure we have opportunity there. And that's, as a young farmer, and I know a lot of our members will say that too, we see opportunity there to stand up and to fight and to embrace these challenges. And I suppose this is not an insult to older people, but it's human nature that older people don't adapt to change as fast. Younger people will adapt to change quicker, and they'll have more of an appetite for that, and that's constantly what we're seeing amongst members. So we need to be supported to do that.
You're only as strong as your weakest link in the whole chain. I mean, you could have a row of farmers along the river doing everything right. One of them doing something wrong that brings everybody else down. Do you think there's been a problem in the last number of years getting your message across? Is there a problem in messaging the farmer's story to the consumer?
Yeah, I think there is, Damien. I think it's to the consumer as well, and to farmers as a whole. And I think that's why the Signpost programme is such a good initiative. I think that is a key point, is that farmers can't do it on their own, the government can't do it on their own, economists can't, ecologists can't. We all need to work together. It needs to be a whole of industry, a whole of sector, a whole of government approach for this to work. We just need unity and solidarity to get our message across, because it's okay, all the Signpost programme farmers, they could all implement all these measures, but we wouldn't get too far to hit our targets. So it's so important to bring everyone along with us, and that starts with us. We're at the centre of this, the Signpost programme, and that branches out to your discussion groups, and that branches out further to farmers on the ground, and that's how the whole process works. So we have an important role to play in, I suppose, and it starts off with all the advisory and the research and the education, and we have to get that message out to the wider industry, and that includes the public as well. So that's something I think we're becoming more and more conscious of as well, and it's something Macra's been doing lately, and our own president has been advocating on behalf of Macra for the last number of months, and particularly in this whole climate change debate and I suppose this whole area, this conundrum we're calling it, that we are up for the challenge, and that we're trying to get that message across in more of a positive approach, like to say that we're actually part of the solution rather than being the problem. And I think the public are starting to buy into that as well, and I think it's important that we keep that momentum going, and particularly for young farmers, we need to be at the centre of the decision making in all this whole, in the CAP strategic planning, in the carbon budgets, in the nitrates. We need to be at the forefront of all the decision making.
As you say there, farmers can't, no one part of the food chain can do it on their own. Pat Murphy, CEO of Kerry Group, said dairy business. I suppose the question to you on that is, from an industry perspective, your area and Shane's area of agriculture, which is dairying, faces the biggest challenges in meeting these targets over the next few years. How does the industry plan to support suppliers in meeting the demands from the other end of the food chain?
Very good, Damien, and thanks to Macra for the invite today. Look, I think from the industry perspective, I suppose, first of all, we go back to our customers across the globe. The output from Ireland goes into the major global food companies across the world, companies like Nestle or Unilever or McDonald's or Starbucks. So our dairy has a great reputation across the world. And obviously, when we talk to these customers, the 2 or 3 criteria that they call out that we have to achieve in the future is we have to continue with our best-in-class quality, our traceability, and our security of supply, which has been very come to the fore over the last a couple of years because of the COVID situation. But now, of course, they say as well, but you also now have to show us how you're going to reduce your carbon footprint of the dairy that you're selling us into the future. And, if I go back then obviously to the carbon footprint of dairy, whether it's butter or cheese, 90% of the footprint comes from within the farm, and 10% comes from the factory that processes that milk into the finished product and in the supply chain to take that product from Ireland across the world. And so at this stage, I suppose the industry has called out very clearly that we're committed to helping farmers. We have to put better incentives on the table to support guys like Shane to adopt the MAC. I mean, Frank has gone through the Teagasc MAC program or actions. And so I think from an industry perspective, we now have to incentivize farmers to adopt these practices by giving them a better price for that milk, etc. And of course, then if our customers want more sustainable dairy going into the future, they also have to pay extra for that as well. And so that's the challenge we will face over the next couple of years, because customers, there's huge competition out there for dairy going into all these big global accounts or global customers. And so if our dairy is 10% more expensive, it becomes a little bit then difficult to capture market share. But I think there's a realization at the moment from our leading customers and the ones that we talk to regularly is that over time they will pay more for sustainable dairy, because they are also being measured by their investors in terms of on a lot of these big global customers are on the stock exchanges or whatever, and so their investors are saying to them, unless you are now going to take this thing seriously and reduce your footprint of a Kit Kat bar of chocolate, or a Cadbury's bar of chocolate, or a Starbucks latte, well then we won't invest in your business in the future. So I think this is I think Shane met it very well. This is a whole of government, whole of sector, whole of industry approach to try and solve this conundrum, as you called it on the title page.
Yeah, so I mean, is the command structure now firmly the consumer, and a more discerning and a more questioning consumer and customer firmly at the top of that command structure now, and the producer firmly at the bottom of it?
I mean, this is going to be a balance. I mean, the consumers, especially the new generation consumers, are saying that they want a bit more flexibility in their diets. They look at the intensity of the carbon footprint of a dairy product versus a plant-based product, etc. So they're looking for more, more kind of a personal nutrition balance into what they consume. So I mean, I can't say that the primary producer is at the end of the scale. This has to be a common approach by all stakeholders to try and make sure that the economic viability, or so we always talk about the sustainability and the economic part of that, the environment and the social side of it. So without primary producers making a good return on what they're doing, there is no future to any of this business. So I think the solution is that food will become more expensive over the next 10 years. It has to become more expensive. We all know the statistics that today, the average consumer or the average household spends maybe less than 10% on food, whereas 15 years ago that was up at 20%, or 20 years ago. So food has become too cheap or too inexpensive over the last 10, 15 years, and that balance has to be addressed. Otherwise, this is going to be a very difficult sell for primary producers, the farmers, the processors, and even the customers like him.
I suppose that 10% thing, we could argue about that all the time, that costs of living in other areas have increased quite a lot and squeezed, I suppose, that percentage down towards 10%. Maybe Colm can correct me on that, but there are so many other child costs and cost of living, I suppose, that mean that we are spending less on our food. Anyway, we might come back to that. Just before I go back to Frank O'Mara, Shane, listening to Pat there, as a supplier, what could the industry be doing more to kind of help you along this journey?
Well, I suppose,
apart from paying you more per litre, but is there anything else they could be doing?
Well, that is probably the main way, is that we obviously need more money to invest in all these. But I suppose a lot of it, I know that I supplied Lambie, and that they have a lot of different initiatives in relation to, I suppose, Operation Biodiversity, and I suppose encouraging more renewable energies like the solar panels and that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of the approach that they'll have to take, I suppose, just to facilitate the investment in the green technologies. Possibly it could be payments linked to, I suppose, increasing your biodiversity and percentages on farms. There could be ways to encourage that through the milk price as well. But I suppose at the end of the day, a lot of it is going to come down to the farmers on the ground, and once the support is in place to do that, it's up to us then to implement them on the farms. And then that'll have a knock-on effect overall on the whole industry. But I suppose we just need to be, as we've mentioned a few times, that we need support from the whole of industry. Everyone needs to buy in together, and it's something, I suppose, that I'd be very conscious about myself, is that we can't do it on our own. And I'm a firm believer that, I suppose, people should come onto the farm as well, whether that be the processors themselves, people working for them, whether it be like ecologists, whether it be the scientists, the researchers, that they all work together, and the farmers get the best advice. I think often, and I think as we mentioned before, is education is often one of the key aspects of this, as well as the funding, because it's okay to have the money there and the support, but if farmers are maybe educated enough to realise actually what are these measures going to, what impact will they have on the environment and on their farms, I think that's important. And
I think some of the co-ops, as I've heard, have been helping suppliers as well, helping their customers to actually learn a little bit more in conjunction with universities and with environmental courses and so on. Frank, just bringing you back in here at this point in relation to Teagasc, we've been hearing in recent weeks that the full implementation of new technological breakthroughs over the next 2 years will automatically lead to an 18% reduction in emissions. Then we see the carbon budget is demanding more than that. Can that 18%, can we squeeze a little bit more out of that in terms of technology over the next 5-10 years? And when are we actually going to see the results of what's going on now?
Yeah. Good question, Damien. And yes, look, I think that's what we're saying. We can, by investing in the research and investing then in supporting farmers, in the advisory service to support farmers, we can get to those targets, the national targets of somewhere between 22 and 30%. It's not going to be easy, you know what I mean? And it will take that investment in research. It will take sort of everybody working together. You know, I think, you know, obviously farmers are the ones at the coal face. They're the ones that have to adopt technologies, but there is a huge role for the processors, as Pat has said, and I think they're up for it, and on the meat side as well, and a huge role for state agencies like ourselves then to support the whole process, and the universities. So look, it can be done, Damien. It's not a simple walk in the park. But I don't think we're at the stage of having to look for a cut in the national herd or a cut in herds in order to reach our targets. I think there's this pathway through technologies to get us there. Obviously, we are also going to see, the government putting a lot of money into things like organics, and they're going to be trying to sort out the whole forestry, the forestry licensing issues, so that people will be encouraged to plant forestry again. So we will see diversification. And, look, to me, that's not a problem. If a livestock farmer wants to get out of livestock and plant land in forestry, there's a reduction in the national herd, but it's done by choice. So I don't have any difficulty with that. Or if a livestock farmer wants to go organics and reduces overall output on the farm, but they're farming the way they want to, well, we're there to support them if that's what they want to do.
Okay, well, what is your position? What is the Teagasc position in relation to organics? Are we getting mixed messaging there? We're kind of getting the impression, look, it's not worth it because there isn't a price premium there for organics versus conventional product. And a lot of people are questioning that. So what is the Teagasc view on organics? I see where you actually have set up a Twitter account, Teagasc Organics, this week. So is there going to be a push in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely, Damien. And hopefully you're one of the followers of that account already. So
I don't do Twitter, but I just heard about it. Go on anyway.
Okay. Look, we're there to support any farmer, whatever enterprise they're in. If it's ducks or if it's geese or if it's dairy or beef or tillage or organics or whatever, we're there to support all. We are going to put more resources into organics because the government have a big campaign, and there's going to be a lot of money available to farmers to convert into organics. So we're going to need more resources, and we have a decent program, I would say, going on already. I suppose the issue that all of us see with regard to organics, it's one thing to get farmers in, but then how do we develop the market for a significant increase in organic produce? That needs to be done as well. That's not really our job, I suppose. We're on the production, on the farm end. But if that doesn't go hand in hand, well, then I think you'll end up with a lot of disappointed organic farmers who've got in, but they'll find that they're getting no more for their produce than their conventional farming neighbours. And so look, that's I suppose the issue that a lot of people are talking about with regard to this push in organics.
Yeah. Colm, when we look at, I suppose, the evolution of the Irish economy over the last 20 years or 50 years, we see an awful lot of foreign direct investment, and we look at our exports and where, pharma is accounting for an awful lot of that, although it's coming from foreign direct investment. How important is the agri-food sector from, farming right through to secondary processing still to this country, to rural Ireland? In a county like Laois, for example, we're in today.
It's pretty important. Every sector exaggerates its own importance a little bit. The officials in the Department of Finance years ago used to play a game. They used to keep a tot, and they would get in submissions from different sectors, which would say that we employ so many people, but indirectly we employed tens of thousands of more people and so on. They used to tot it up, and they eventually concluded that population of Ireland was much bigger than anybody had suspected.
It was like all the ones in the GPO in 1960.
It's a touch
inflated, yeah.
So there's a bit of a exaggeration, and maybe nothing wrong with that either. It's a very important sector. I remember the exhilaration in 2015 when the milk quotas were scrapped, and people predicted, and they were right, that milk output here would go up. I'm sure you all know that milk output has not gone up in lots of other places around Europe. Why is that? Economists are very simple people. The distribution of agricultural production across Europe is not an accident. There are no vineyards in Donegal. There's a reason for that. There is tillage farming in the east of England. There's not in the southwest of England.
Well, we were going to have, so what you're saying...
So just on the point about organics and about consumer preferences, and Kerry and Glanby and all the others, I'm sure, are well aware that people want to think that the products they're consuming are climate friendly. Dairy production in Ireland, if we believe the research, is climate friendly because the emissions per litre of product are lower here than they are in most other countries.
But then we read the EPA reports about water quality deteriorating.
Yeah, there's no question but that improvements can be made in runoff into rivers and streams. I mean, the evidence is there. We have not just rivers, but inland lakes and so on that are not at the standards that they ought to be at, and farmers are partly to blame for that.
Yeah.
So that's fair enough. That has to be dealt with.
And it is an issue, as we read recently, right across Europe. In fact, it's not just an Irish problem. That's not to diminish what the story is in Ireland. But just going back, Colm, to you spoke there, and I'm going to bring Paddy in again at this point. You talked about the abolition of milk quotas and why it should be no surprise that we were the fastest growing supplier of milk in Europe after that, when compared to other countries where milk production is not necessarily the big thing, where wine and other enterprises are bigger. But how much of that, though, as well, was natural? And how much of it was farmers almost being embarrassed into producing more milk? In other words, the government, the banks, maybe even Teagasc as well, other state bodies saying you're at nothing unless you're going to increase production. And the farmers were made feel that they were at nothing unless they actually doubled production or increased the cow numbers on their farms. And that now been a bit of a mistake, and a lot of farmers regretting it.
Yeah, I don't know whether they regret it or not. You appear to be of the view that Irish farmers are more easily embarrassed than farmers in other countries where milk quotas were also lifted. The pattern of agricultural production reflects soil, climate. Ireland doesn't have a lot of mountains, it doesn't have a lot of forests, it has a lot of productive arable land as a percentage of the total land area. So it is a big agricultural exporter. That's nobody's fault, that's not a problem. It's just a fact, that's the way it is.
But was it too quick?
And the way we measured these emissions, I'm surprised that Irish governments down the years haven't kicked back more about the mismeasurement of emissions. You mentioned the EPA. Is credit given to dairying as against tillage farms? I don't know much about farming, but I do know the tillage farms don't have any trees or hedgerows on them. And dairy farms are carved up into 3 and 4 acre fields for very good reasons, shelter and shade. That is not taken into account in the way they ascribe.
We've enough
emissions.
problems with dairy farmers and beef farmers fighting with each other without now bringing the tillage men in.
No, it's the EPA that I'm fighting with now.
Yeah,
Don't get involved in that one.
Pat, can I just bring you back in on that? I was at a conference recently where some of your colleagues were saying that, unless we actually are seen to demonstrate our credentials in relation to reducing emissions, Danone, for example, in the business that you're in, they have global targets, and unless they can carbon neutralize their plants in Ireland, they're going to lose business because the clock is ticking. Their customers are demanding this. Are you finding that as well as a processor? That you are going to have to be seen, not only the farmer producer, but that you as a business are going to have to start looking to process in a greener way and using more renewables, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, Damien. As I said, I mean, all our 95% of our dairy that we produce in Ireland goes to customers across the world. So we have no choice but to look at our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions inside our factory gates to reduce those over the next number of years. And as part of the Climate Action Plan, we have targets as well, something up at 60-70% to reduce our emissions from our factories. And there are good plans. I mean, there's good progress made over the last number of years. We don't burn as much coal anymore in the industry today as we were doing maybe 10 years ago. But of course, there's a lot more to be done in terms of, I think somebody mentioned there about anaerobic digestion, or renewable gas or whatever. So I mean, we're very much at an infancy stage in Ireland around renewable electricity or around biomethane, etc. So there has to be a huge amount of focus and effort by the government and by the industry and by the farmers and all the stakeholders to see, so how can we get better at adopting technology that's already out there? I mean, countries like Germany or in France, where AD is quite common at farm level, and it's not here at all. I know that there's an AD plant now being commissioned up in Teagasc, up in Grange. So hopefully over the next number of years, that'll show how these plants can contribute to reducing footprint at a factory perspective. But you're dead right. Unless the industry also reduces its Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, And as I said, like that represents about 10% of the overall footprint of dairy. I mean, obviously the farming side of it, the 90%, if we don't tackle that as well at the same time, you know, then we're not going to make the progress we need to make over the next number of years.
Okay, Colm, just to come back to you on that, you know, when you run the numbers on renewables, what's your opinion on that? Are we way behind? Have we great opportunities there to maximise the land that we have in terms of renewable energy?
Well, we've rather more wind installed now in terms of installed capacity than a lot of countries in Europe. On solar, we haven't really got going yet, and offshore wind is costly. I mean, it's quite dear to stick wind farms out in the Atlantic, and the industry keeps, oh, we've terrific wind out in the Atlantic. Well, sure, but the industry is keen that the government will provide the grid. If you fish out in the Atlantic and you find very valuable fish out there, the government doesn't bring your fish to the Paris fish market for you for free. So there's quite a lot of
anaerobic digestion, solar power on farms.
Well, I think wind and solar are proven and available technologies that are capable of being deployed. Now, who should pay for transmission is another story. Obviously, the industries would like you and me to pay for it rather than they pay for it. Some of the other technologies, and I think this is a bit of a trap for the green campaigners. People are pushing technologies that might happen and might work, but might not. There was a big article in the Financial Times the other day about nuclear fusion, and it reminds me of what Charles de Gaulle said about on a trip to Brazil once. He said Brazil has a great future and it always will have. And fusion is, people have been at it for 50 years. Tidal power, in Japan, they have spent uncountable hundreds of millions on tidal. They've no energy, domestic energy in Japan, as you probably know. They've spent uncountable millions on tidal for 30 or 40 years. Maybe these things will happen. But I think policy should really focus here in Ireland on technologies that we know work and how you best integrate those into the grid and how you try and electrify the car fleet and the light van fleet. They're doable things. We know how to do those things.
Okay, Frank O'Mara, just on that, are renewables part of the Teagasc agenda into the future?
Yes, look, I think now there are actually very good opportunities around solar PV, in particular on dairy farms, where you're going to use some of that electricity yourself, and therefore you're offsetting, 17 or 18 cent a unit by anything you produce. I think the whole anaerobic digestion producing gas, there is, I think, a role for that, because companies like Pat, it's hard to, as I understand it, it's hard to convert dryers to electricity. So you actually do need to be burning a fuel in places. So renewable gas has a role there, and anaerobic digestion is well distributed throughout Europe, and including in Northern Ireland. I think I saw there's something like 90 farm level anaerobic digesters working in Northern Ireland. We have very few down here because I suppose we, as Colm said, we've concentrated our renewable investment towards wind over the last number of years. So look, I think we probably will see the emergence of an anaerobic digestion based renewable energy industry down here in the south. I don't know how big it'll be, but it's something we'll be, as you said, or somebody said, we're opening a pilot scale anaerobic digester in Grange next year using silage and a mixture of silage and slurry, producing biomethane that's directly injectable into the national gas pipe distribution network. So, it's a very usable fuel like that, or it can be used in transport vehicles directly. So it is part of our, we absolutely do see it as one of the things we're going to be working on, Damien.
Okay, I'm going to make just two final points. First of all, back to you, Pat. I suppose couldn't let you go at a conference like this without asking you, what, I know it's crystal ball time, and it's a volatile sector, but just looking into 2022, how are things looking for for dairy farming and milk price?
Sure, that's always a difficult question to answer. But I mean, look, we've seen on the supply side over the last couple of months, New Zealand America, Western Europe, Germany, France, UK, Netherlands, they're all coming back in terms of output of milk compared to the same time last year. So at the moment there's a squeeze on dairy in terms of supply. The demand is quite good over the last couple of months. I mean, China has driven the demand side over the last 12 to 18 months. Now China is easing off, but there's other countries in Southeast Asia kind of taking up the mantle there. So from a milk price perspective for the next 6 months, it's going to be pretty strong, I would say. It's going to be strong for the next 6 months at least. But obviously, then things like at farm level, fertilizer prices next year are going to go through the roof. Compound feed is going to be a bit more expensive as well. So there are costs coming in at farm level, and of course at industry level, the price of natural gas has gone through the roof over the last 2 months. And so that's adding a lot of cost onto converting milk into the products that we make in the different sites across Ireland from a dairy perspective. But overall, Damien, quite a good prognosis for milk prices over the next 6 months.
All right, okay, that'll be music to your ears, Shane. And just before we finish up, you're a young farmer, you're typical of, a young dairy farmer that's involved, obviously, in an awful lot of schemes of being on your farm and see what you do there. And as you say, if more and more farmers adopted the smart farming sort of way of doing things on the farm with low emission slurry, spreading buffer zones and so on and so forth, it might help us get to targets a lot quicker. But what is the mood like? Just briefly before we go, what's your mood like? Are you worried? Are you concerned? Are you confident? How do you sum it up now when you listen to everybody from all different areas talking here today, for example, into the next 5-6 years?
Well, I suppose from my own personal point of view, my mood would be, I'd be positive. I'm a naturally positive type person, and I suppose luckily I'm in, a good part of the country for producing milk, and I suppose that the dairy side of things has obviously been positive for the last few years, but again, coming down the line, we have higher input costs coming next year, and there's so much uncertainty. So I suppose the whole area around what's going to happen over the next 10 years, there's still so much confusion, and the goalposts are changing so often in relation to policy. It's very hard to plan 5-10 years ahead now. We're taking things year to year. So I think that's probably the biggest thing for young farmers. I think it's very hard to entice people into any industry when you can make and we were talking about earlier on with the financials. Yeah. You can have a 5-10 year business plan in place. It's so much easier to get finance. It's so much easier to actually, for the parents to say, I'm going to transfer over the land. You can see your plan is in place. But if you're only working on a year to year basis, it's very difficult to plan and to actually see a future there. So I think for young farmers, we need to have certainty there. We need to have that roadmap there. And once we have that roadmap there, farmers and young farmers in particular will embrace change. We'll step up to the plate. We need to be shown what to do. We need to be supported to do that, and we'll get there.
You follow the money, as they say. Sorry, I dropped the mic. You'll follow the money, as they say. Okay, we're going to leave it there, as I just maybe that's a sign. It's time to give up, and my microphone is falling off me here. My apologies for that. But listen, thank you all very much. Colm, thank you so much for joining us here today. Thanks to our guests as well, Frank O'Mara and Pat Murphy, for joining us virtually as well, and to Shane also. Thank you all very much indeed. All right, we're going to wrap up now with the President, John Keane. John, if you'd like to come over, and you're free to go there, guys. And I just want to bring John over. Maybe, John, if you want to take a seat here, just to maybe wrap up. By the way, Shane mentioned there about the costs, the input costs. If I can give a plug to our own programme, Countrywide on Radio 1 tomorrow at 8 o'clock, we'll have a special report on the rising input costs and what's driving it and where that might actually be going. So, John Keane, we're going to wrap up now. The spuds are on. It is 1 o'clock, and a lot of your members, I presume, still take the dinner in the middle of the day and all of that. But listening to all the contributions over the last couple of hours or so, what's your response? How do you feel?
Thanks, Damien. And I suppose to follow on from what Shane has said, there is a great degree of positivity and optimism, I think, from all the contributors that we've had today, as well as from discussions from people in the room at break time. And I suppose to take you briefly through the panels and some immediate reaction to it, I suppose starting off first and foremost with the Minister himself, it is, I suppose, really apparent the role of the Land Mobility Service has to play. And it is really welcome, and I mentioned it on the VT as well, we welcome the Minister's commitment to that. I suppose from a young farmer's perspective and from a future-looking perspective, it is important that this is the first step along the journey in terms of supporting and building on the Land Mobility Service. And the Minister himself mentioned about the role of Teagasc in terms of developing and building on it. And thank you very much to Frank for being part of our final panel. We look forward, absolutely, engaging through John Buckley on the Teagasc Authority, our representative, to engage more on it and to develop the Land Mobility Service further. I suppose it is an important topic in terms of the climate ambition and the topic today in terms of the conundrum and young farmers up to the challenge. And it is heartening and it is welcome to hear the Minister's comments around that yes, the target is challenging, but that the target is achievable. And I think his own sentiment around the narrative around farmers being champions of climate change is very, very welcome, because the reality of it is those who are most sensitive to it are the actual farmers on the ground. And it is important to note for people here and people listening at home as well is that currently agriculture is the only sector that has a roadmap plan to deliver on our climate targets over the next number of years. I was engaged with Ag Climatise, and there's a roadmap plan for further engagement with the Minister over the next number of months and years ahead to come. So that is where the roadmap is. And I think the Minister's comments around CAP addressing the barriers, the real litmus test for this CAP has to be the number of young farmers that are engaged actively in farming at the end of 2027. We've seen over the past period of CAP that there's a 15% decrease in the number of farmers. It's gone from 8,700 under the age of 35 to 7,400. And that's a trend we just can't tolerate any longer. Diane outlined that across Europe, the trend is very similar. And from our side of things in Ireland, we need young farmers to be the drivers of that change. And similar to, it is, I suppose, heartening, and it's something we know through Thomas's work in CEJA, that the barriers affecting young people entering farming in Ireland are reflected across Eurozone. So we've seen those in terms of access to land, in terms of access to credit, in terms of access to investment support. Those are some of the key contributors to preventing young people, and they need to be addressed. And the message is clear from young farmers, and it's clear from Diane as well, that the Commission has laid out a document and a pathway which allows and facilitates governments to design their own CAP strategic plan. What we need now is our government to deliver on that in terms of generation renewal. The land mobility is one step. We have the issues of succession pathways and the issues of access to finance, which need to be addressed. I welcome, I suppose, Sean's comments in terms of the low levels of borrowings on Irish farms, and I jotted down some of them. A third of farms in Ireland only have debt, 25% less debt on farms now than versus 10 years ago. And I suppose one of the key bones of confidence that must come from this in terms of a message to financial lenders as well as young farmers and farmers in general is that his comments around very few defaults from Irish farmers on loans. And I suppose the key thing is, let this be a message from farmers and from young farmers on the ability of young farmers to meet that risk and to provide the reward, not just for their businesses, but for the financial aspect of their enterprises also. And we welcome the sustainable funding model and the green architecture and the green finance as a way to move forward. So Sean also mentioned around the carbon footprint of Irish farming. It is important at this stage to note that we have been measuring that for a long number of years. We're a world leader in that, a world first. Over 200,000 on-farm audits have been conducted by Board BIA to measure the climate and carbon footprint from Irish farms. And that has reduced from 1.1 kilos of carbon from a dairy perspective to 0.99 over the past 5 or 6 year period. Similarly, beef farmers have reduced their environmental input from a carbon point of view as well, down from in the region of 11.8 to 11.5. So progress is being made. We are moving in the right direction. I suppose to follow on, Declan made the important point around the viability of our sector, and that being the single biggest driver for young people entering into the sector. And he also addressed that the access to land is the biggest issue in terms of entry, but also in terms of financing that. And your conversation with Diane around the women in agriculture piece was very apt. We've seen in the context of this CAP, there has been provisions made. I think that's the first step. We need to continue to drive that conversation, and that might be rich coming from a man, but we have to continue to drive and to support that conversation, because not alone is there barriers for young farmers entering the sector. Similarly, there is barriers for women entering the sector, and we as young farmers can relate to that. So I think And within our own organisation, we see our Women in Agriculture group, chaired by Caroline O'Keefe, is driving that forward. And that's a very key pathway in terms of delivering on that as well. I suppose Declan also talked about the around the farm kitchen table discussion around succession. And Dennis would have spoken about this before, and Derry and Gillian and many others around the Ag Affairs table, that discussion can often be the most important thing for shaping a person's attitude to engaging in the sector going forward. So there needs to be I suppose, an education piece that Declan touched on around that knowledge transfer piece, around that succession on farm, and the need for that to be facilitated, the need for that to be a positive engagement, and to show that, yes, we can provide a pathway and that the viability of our enterprises must be improved at the same time. I suppose the interventions that were spoken about by Diane at EU level in terms of access to finance, access to credit, but also the succession scheme, and Declan touched on it too, that other EU member states are actively engaged in terms of developing succession pathways and variations of a succession scheme. And I suppose tying both Diana's comments and Declan's comments together, it is important that our own policymakers within the department and the minister realise that a succession scheme that's developed must provide an opportunity for older farmers to step back from farming, but also must provide an opportunity for young farmers to step forward. And there is a financial element to that, there is an education element to that, and there is the elements of finance that we've touched on previously as well. And I think that's Declan pines around the adaptation of a succession scheme very much aligns itself with what we would have been looking for in the past number of years as well. I suppose Frank followed on from what the Minister said in terms of that we have a plan. There is a roadmap charted forward. Yes, there are some uncertainty around the technologies that can be delivered, but there is a pathway forward. And delighted that Shane was as clear as he was in terms of the work that he's doing on farm that is driving that, and the support that's there from a sector point of view, as well as from an environmental point of view. Those farms, those signpost farms, are charting the map forward for our sector. I touched on it at the very start. When you are a world leader, when you are the very best, let's continue to drive that. Let's make the bar so high that the chasing pack can't attain it. I was going to use the analogy of the All Blacks, but I said, seeing as Ireland defeated them a number of weeks ago, it does show that that's possible. But if you're best in class, why not continue to drive that forward and make it unattainable for others? I suppose the ways in which Frank taught about the technical advancements on farm, the clover, the fertiliser, the slurry application, the use of new genetics, that's one pillar he spoke about, and that's very important. I think the research side of what's being developed, whether that be feed additives, whether that be the introduction of new fertilisers onto the market and the role industry has to play in that, is very important. I suppose the big picture piece was along with Frank and Shane, was Colm provided us with the overall point of view, and I think it's a very apt sentence that there's one atmosphere but 200 governments. And I think the reality of it is, in parts of the world where it's favourable for producing food, we all have to eat. The global population is going to grow by 2.5 million in the course of the next 29 years. That's what it's predicted to do. Our current population, there is already regions starving, and our population is going to grow. So why would we not have the most sustainable food production in the world, continuing to do that and continuing to meet our climate objectives? And that's a very core and fundamental part of all of this conversation. And the accounting piece was something which was, I suppose, interesting and not new, and I know you reflected on it too in terms of Colm's article, Damien, in terms of the food production in areas versus the energy production. And that accounting system is something which needs revision. And I recently at an event myself in terms of the role that GWP Star accounting has to play after 2030. And I suppose the fact that that is showing that by 2037, should we continue on this pathway, the methane emissions from agriculture will actually, in Ireland, will have a cooling effect by the end of the decade, 2030 to 2040. So that is the policy context in which we're operating in. And it was touched on by both Frank and also by Colm and Shane as well, in terms of the language that's used around agriculture. And it was mentioned about the Almarai, and you mentioned it about the milk produced in Saudi Arabia. That Irish agriculture is not comparable to intensive dairy systems across the globe. It just simply isn't. If you look at the examples that you outlined and that others outlined as well, you have 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 animals in a desert under a roof, and everything has to be brought in. Water. You look at water usage, 6,000 litres of water to produce 1 litre of milk. In Ireland, the Carberry study shows it's around 8 litres. You look at forage imports, forage from South America being shipped to those countries. In Ireland, we have all that on our doorstep. So it is not fair to call the agriculture sector in Ireland intensive when you're comparing that to the global scale. And again, to touch back on Shane's points in terms of the appetite from young farmers to meet that challenge and to message to consumers is a role of Irish farmers, it's a role of the industry, it's a role of the media, and it is a very important role of our political representatives as well. That narrative of what actually happens on the ground in Irish farms is reflected in what they're contributing. I suppose Pat talked about the appetite of consumers driving the market, and I know you mentioned about put a picture in people's head of consumers at the top and maybe farmers at the bottom. And I wouldn't necessarily, and Pat did allude to it too, but I think that the consumers driving the market is a very positive thing for Irish farmers, because let's examine it. When you are the best, if the consumer wants the best, well, when you're looking at it, why not be the best? And we are the best. So I think from that point of view, that's a positive reinforcement that we need to ensure is kept within the marketplace. Farmers, industry, Board BIA, all of those have a role to play in terms of that. I suppose, and it was mentioned, Damien, and it is a sort of a bugbear of my own too, but it's just to keep the science and the facts at the forefront of what we do. It was mentioned around water quality in Irish agriculture. And it is important that we've been consistently monitoring that since the early 1990s. And in terms of the good status waters and very good status waters, that has remained relatively the same, 55, 57, 58% of our entire bodies. If we look at the percentage of bad waterways classified as bad in the early 1992, it was in the region of 4.5%. You're now less than 0.5%, or in the region of 0.5% classified as bad quality. Moderate status has increased over that time, and poor quality status has decreased over time. So we are improving. We absolutely, hands up, we have a role to play, but it is important to acknowledge the road that we've travelled over the past 30 years in terms of that. And I suppose just the final piece before I hand back to yourself, Damien, is the look at science and the look at the opportunity that we have. I mentioned the GWP star. I mentioned in terms of the reductions in our carbon footprint per unit kilo. I know there is preliminary research ongoing in Moorpark at the moment in terms of calculating the actual methane factor versus the calculation. And some of those are showing that we're over-calculating, based on international data, the actual output of methane of an Irish livestock animal based on the forage-based diet that we have here. We also look at the research that's being provided in terms of the emissions from our soils. It is preliminary showing that mineral soils are actually sequestering carbon, and that the emissions from a soils perspective in peatland, we're actually overestimating it. So that's preliminary research and it has to be verified, but the early indications are very positive. And the opportunities that Frank and Colm and Shane touched on in terms of anaerobic digestion development, renewable energy development, all of these are pathways and diversification models which farmers and young farmers can develop in. So yes, we have challenges, yes, we have opportunities, and it's up for the policymakers and the transition to be facilitated for farmers and for young farmers. But as I say, the litmus test of all of what is going on is to ensure that young farmers are at the centre of it, targets are provided for young farmers, and that policy, as Diana said, young farmers are at the core of it. We've heard the rhetoric and talk and the importance of it, but let us look at our climate action plan that came out a few weeks ago, 40 actions, none of them specifically addressing young farmers. So yes, we welcome the talk and the sentiment, but we need to see the actions.
Okay, well, indeed, on that note, John, we're going to leave it there. And thank you very much for that synopsis of the day's events so far. So I think we're almost done. In fact, we are done. Have you anything else?
No,
to say?
just a couple of final thank yous, really, yeah. Damien. In reality, I suppose first of all, with the first panel, to thank the Minister for his contribution today. I know he took out time during his busy week to contribute as well, and he did express his interest to be returning to our physical event next year. So we'll hold him to that promise. But absolutely, thank him for his time. The second panel, to Diana, to Sean, and to Declan as well for their time and contribution. Hugely valued, a varying degree of perspectives from across an EU point of view as well as internally within Ireland. Our third panel, in terms of Shane, Colm and Frank, absolutely a brilliant discussion around the opportunities that are there in the sector as well as the challenge. And I think there was a real reality in terms of that panel as well, that yes, we have challenges, but there are opportunities to meet that. To yourself, Damien, I know you're always on the end of the phone from us inside Macra, and that's very much appreciated, because I know you're a very busy man, but I suppose your professionalism and leading the conversation is absolutely hugely important. So an absolutely massive thank you for that. To all events production, who are the men in the background keeping us all sounding and looking great. We had a half-time mix-up with my own tie. So all of those little things are much appreciated, and it's a huge thank you to those. To the hotel here in Killenard, in the Heritage, massive thank you for facilitating the event, and as you say, the spuds are boiling. I hope they're not burnt. I'm after talking for so long. To all the Macra team who made this event possible today, behind the scenes, that this wouldn't happen without you. A particular note to both Lisa, who put in huge work in terms of behind the scenes, and I will single out Gillian because she is probably sick to the teeth of me in terms of annoying her about what's happening and what's this and what's that. And with COVID and the changes that have happened, it has been a real challenge, but I think we'll all agree that what was put together today was absolutely fantastic. And just finally, before the audience and the people who joined in, I would also like to just acknowledge, as the Minister did, that this is Dennis Duggan's final day within the organisation. 5 years at the helm and steering the organisation forward. We've come through a huge amount of change in that period of time, and progress has been made, and I think it's important to acknowledge that on this, the last day. So a huge thank you, Dennis, from myself on behalf of the organisation and all the volunteers for your dedication and work. And I know you'll be hanging around the fridges for a little bit longer, but today is the official last day, so just thank you very much for that. And finally, to the people who've joined in the room and made the effort, as well as those who've joined in online, really appreciate your time. I know the recording will be available on our own platforms in the next little while, so and absolutely a massive thank you to all of those.
And that's it. Thank you very much. Well done to yourself, John, and the very best of luck in your term as president of Macra na Feirme. And that's all we have from today. Thank you for watching. Thanks to our guests here. And as we say, hopefully next year we'll be all together in the one room. Bye-bye, and thanks very much.
Super.
Well done, John.